Alright, welcome to my virtual lecture on time, duration, and memory. Um, this is probably one of my favorite topics to talk about because there's so much uh, to be learned and to be continued to learn with regards to duration and specifically memory as well. So what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about um, starting off by talking about duration. Now, if you want, feel free to pull out your handout that I gave you at the end of class, which are sort of the cliff notes for this lecture. And I'll be kind of following that off and on, so feel free to pull that out if you think that helps. Alright, so let's start off by talking about duration. Okay? So, unlike time, duration is a successive qualitative change. Alright, so what does that mean? What is something that is a qualitative change that successively happens? I believe, and from the readings, hopefully you will see that successive qualitative changes are essentially sequences that permeate each other. It's sort of a temporal continuum. They're, it, best way to describe it is take a look at this map here of the state of Washington. Um, Starting off at the ocean over here, um, you can clearly see that if you were to drive across the state of Washington, starting from this coast here and driving across something like this to eastern Washington, there would be these successive qualitative changes, or these sequences. In this case, the change in landscape, these sequences that would permeate one another. The transition from the coast all the way inland, going up and over the mountains and back down the mountains, and then into the high desert, and then into the plains, and then back over to Spokane, which is kind of sort of this high um, coniferous forest as well. The the sequence from one end to the other would the sequences, there are multiple, infinite, really, amount of sequences from one end of the state to the other end of the state. They would permeate one another. There isn't sort of a really fine line per se. I mean, I think you could maybe um, on the map you might be able to draw where sort of the tree line stops and where it begins, but the reality of it is that there really is um, this permeable transition of landscape where the trees will actually become more and more sparse, and part of the desert will infiltrate that until there's very, very few trees, until there's hardly any trees, and then no trees at all. Okay? But it's a sequence that is not clearly defined and is actually it's heterogeneous in nature, which is another quality of duration. It's also without precise outlines or boundaries or limits, really. And depending on where you might cross over the mountains, it would be a different transition. Okay. Now I'm using this as an example to display what successive qualitative changes might look like visually, even spatially. Um, Starting off at the coast, you would approach the mountains and it would be fairly flat, but then as soon as you start going up in elevation, the formal qualities would transition and the sequences would permeate one another. One thing to keep in mind is that duration is actually not a period of time. Time in the sense that we measure time, but as defined, duration is actually a a um, well, when it comes to design, it's a successive qualitative change, or it's a temporal continuum. What's interesting is that the definition for the word duration comes from 1300s, 1400s Middle English, which actually stems from the Latin duratio, which is equivalent to the true Latin durat or dure. What's interesting is that the Spanish word um, for lasting or to last is durar, which comes from this derivation here. Um, and duro, which is another Latin word or Spanish word, means hard. Um, so obviously, if you're looking at the historical meaning of duration, it it has something to do with lasting effects, effects that last. Well, we're going to talk about how you make lasting effects, um, not only in your design or things that you see a little bit later when we talk about memory. But for now, um, let's continue talking about duration. Duration is also typically without affiliation of number. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means that it's not measurable. There's really no way to actually measure duration. Um, for example, if you were to think about the change in seasons, um, are the change in seasons time or duration? I'll ask that question again and take a moment to think about it. Are the change in seasons that we experience on Earth, are they um, uh, a, a measurable time or is it a duration? Well, hopefully you said it's a duration. Now, why is that? Well, um, although we have certain um, solstices and equinox that specify the actual physical time of when spring, summer, fall, and winter begin, what's interesting is that um, the, the true seasons they kind of mesh into one another. There's no defined period of time when summer really becomes fall, or when fall, as far as the seasons go, become winter. Trees don't all of a sudden start changing color the same day of the year, as if they were being bound by time. But instead, they're bound by the forces of nature, which would influence this duration. So, thinking about things like our seasons, um, they certainly embody duration and don't follow any sort of time clock. That's why we have short summers, long winters, or long winters and short summers. So it's really experiencing duration. Also, one other aspect of duration that we talked about is this heterogeneous nature of duration. It's made up of composites. Um, One other aspect as well is that duration typically exhibits qualities of dilation and expansion and contraction. Now, the reason that is because duration, in duration, space is preserved, um, whereas in time, space is not preserved. Um, a space can expand and contract or dilate, or an object can expand and contract and dilate, and what you're experiencing is successive qualitative changes in that object. Qualities, not necessarily quantities, but qualities that are changing. Um, so when you think of duration, another aspect of duration would be this idea of dilation or expansion and contraction, and as a result, those those limits are what preserve the space. And we can certainly talk about this more in, in class if you guys have any questions, but keep in mind this is just kind of an overview. And hopefully this may help you in your readings, so maybe listening to this prior to your readings or while you're reading the documents that I've given you might prove to be helpful. Um, So let's talk about some other things that duration incorporates. Um, Duration typically exhibits intensive properties. So what are intensive properties? They're properties that do not depend on the amount of matter present. So regardless of how much matter you have or how much form you have, those intensive properties are always there. For example, if I were to take a piece of gold and I were to take a 1 pound block of gold, if I were to cut that gold in half, the the intensive properties of that gold, such as the density or the color, would not change regardless of the amount. So by cutting it in half, I'm not changing the density. The density still remains the same. I'm not changing the color of it. The color of it still stays the same. So those are intensive properties. Intensive properties do not depend on size. They don't depend on amount. They don't depend on um, different things like that, which are formal in nature. So inherently, duration also is closely linked to the role of things. Um, Now, why is that? Well, for example, if you were to take a task like the act of bowling, there's no time limit per se of, of when you have to bowl when you come up to grab your ball. You can literally stand and hold your ball and then meander on top of the step and then align yourself and then take a few steps and roll the ball down the lane and walk back. Well, that process or that task is not constrained by time, but it is preserved within space. And so therefore, um, these roles are very linked to duration. And we've already talked about the definition of what a role is, and it's that assigned task. So many times when you're thinking about your roles, um, actually, you know what? I got to be conscious of my time here because I think I can only load. All right, let me go back to this. I had to check my time, see how I was doing. So I've got about a minute or so left before I have to stop the video and pick up. So where was I? Oh, so talking about tasks or processes, um, these processes, like for example, bowling, a process or a task has been determined by the motion or use within an interval of form and space. So that's really also what duration incorporates, which is a certain task or a certain motion or a certain change in quality within an interval of form and space. Um, so this kind of brings us to our next topic, which is time. And I think this is probably a good spot for me to pause the video and then pick up on the next part. So just bear with me.